Hi, this is John with Fix-It Planet. Today we're going to replace the screen on this A1671 iPad Pro with 12.9 Wi-Fi and cellular version. And we've preheated it on a hot plate so that we can separate the adhesive around the edges. Once we get a good starting point, we'll be able to get our tool in there. And we're going to go around the left and right sides and the top first, and then we'll do the bottom last. Get a little bit of the bottom there started. So I have a iPad Pro 12.9 first generation video, which really wasn't very good. These repairs are very similar for the most part. We do have the cellular version, so we're trying to be very careful at the top here so we don't damage any of the antenna flex cables at the top. So I wasn't real happy with the first generation video. It just didn't give me as good a result as I would have liked. I think this one turned out a little bit better, but it's also going to point out just a few of the minor differences between this tablet and the first generation tablet. So I've seen some posts where they say they're identical. They're not identical. There are a few minor differences between the two. In general, they're very similar, but there's some subtle changes that they've made, and we'll point that out in this video. So we're just going to take a look down inside there, and you'll notice that it looks more or less the same as the other first gen. You still have very little flexibility there there's one bracket that holds these two cables in, and there's not a lot of room there to open the tablet. So we're going to work on the bottom side now and get this adhesive separated from the bottom edge. But this is where the home button resides, and since there is a security feature programmed into that button, we don't want to damage that flex cable. So we have to be extremely cautious. We don't want to put our tool too far inside, and we don't want to rip that cable. Now I'll be able to reposition the camera a little bit so we can see what's going on this one. You still have two cables running down here, but this metal bracket you can leave intact, and this is the other one we're going to take off. The battery connector is located underneath that metal shielding, but it's down lower towards the display connectors, whereas on the first gen it's up higher. You'll also notice that the metal bracket holding the display cables, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 screws. The first two that I'm taking out are two longer screws. The other 4 are shorter screws. And I'll point that out again later before we put them back in. So pay attention to your screws, because there are different size screws. The metal bracket holding the display connectors in is also slightly different. It has 4 screws instead of 3. And it also has 2 long and 2 short screws. So when we go to remove this, we want to lift this shielding up. We want to be real careful that we don't knock off any components or anything. So we want to just barely get our tweezers in there and lift up on it, get it started. So it will bend up a little bit when you take it off, but it's not going to matter because you can straighten it out a little bit, and then once you get it reasonably straightened back out, it will snap back down and hold itself in place very nicely, so no big deal. And also on the back here, you can kind of see this masking that they've got on there lines up with the components here. So that chip lines up with this little square here, battery on the other side there. Now you'll notice the battery connector is right here near the cables for the display connector. First and foremost, we want to disconnect that battery before we disconnect anything. So we're just going to take a plastic pick and slide it in between there so that it can't make contact with the battery. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 screws holding that metal bracket in. And the screw for the battery is a little bit longer than some of the others, so it is different than the others, so keep it separate. And we'll take a look at the back of this bracket here once I get it removed, and you'll see that it's easy to tell which way it goes. So you'll see that it has a long post on this side, shallow posts on that side, and they correspond with the long screws and the short screws. We use our spudger to just gently pry up these two pop connectors. So you'll notice it is slightly different in appearance. There's two cables that used to run on the right and left side of that daughter board that are no longer there. And these two screws weren't there before either, and the home button actually plugs into its FFC connector that is still attached to this daughter board with the flex cables that we're going to desolder. We're going to go around all the way around the edges of this frame and remove any leftover adhesive. And it's not all of that is in this video, but we do want to point out that once we have all of this leftover adhesive removed, we'll come back again and scrape all the residue and any dirt and debris away from the edges of the frame, and then we'll clean it really good with 100% alcohol before we apply any fresh adhesive. And at some point during the video, I attempted to get the process of putting the adhesive back on in the video, and at some point the camera just stopped recording, it froze or did something and got cut out. So once it was already done, I didn't want to go back and do it all over again just for the video. So I apologize, that little bit of this repair has been cut out. So there's two flex antennas at the bottom as well, but I noticed that they don't stick up as far as the first generation. I kind of like that. I just didn't like the way that the first generation, those antennas, they just stick out. So once you take the screen off, they're sort of compressed in there, and once you take the screen off, they sort of pop out and stick up. You can easily compress them back down when you put the new screen on, but I just didn't like that. Part of my OCD, I guess. So I noticed that these tend to stay flush with the frame even after the screen's been removed, and I like that. And there's a couple of other differences. These are all minor differences between the two, but I think that all in all, the second generation is actually much easier to repair. So you can actually get a replacement screen that comes with the daughter board already pre-soldered on there, but from what I saw, it cost about $100 more. So we're going to go all the way around the edges. We're going to scrape off any additional adhesive, any residue left over, and we're going to clean it with 100% alcohol. Something else a little bit different here is that the daughter board has actually got two FFC connectors, one for each cable, and that's definitely different from the first generation. And also the connector here we're removing the tape off of is the FFC connector for the home button, and I'm exposing one connector and a second connector. So these two cables are plugged in to those two FFC connectors there. They do have little clamps that clamp down. So before you remove them, you want to lift those clamps up, just like with the home button cable. So I'm actually warming it up just a little bit, mainly because there's some hot glue melt, hot snot, whatever you want to call it, right in here around the home button bracket, and just kind of helps to soften that up a little bit, makes it easier to remove. And right here is the home button flex cable. We're going to separate that and remove it from its connector. And then you'll notice that this connector is a part of the daughter board assembly that we're going to desolder, which is also slightly different sort of design from the first generation. The other connector was actually attached to the daughter board, and this one just has a cable that runs up to the daughter board. So we're going to separate the metal bracket over the home button here, and you want to be real careful. Make sure you have good control of your tool, because one slip could be disastrous. We don't want to damage, tear, rip, puncture, cut into the home button flex cable, because we may potentially damage the button, and even the security feature may not work anymore. That would really be bad. So you can see we've removed that with no problems. There's actually zero room for error. If you make a mistake and cut into that button, there's no way to get that repaired. Not without sending it to Apple and having them reprogram a new one. And they're not likely to do that. There is some adhesive that's sticking this daughter board down to the back of the display. We're just going to warm it up a little bit so we can slide a tool underneath there. We'll start with a thin tool, and then we'll use our spudger to avoid doing any damage to the board. Now the cable that runs along the bottom edge of the screen that is attached to this daughter board is basically the same as the first generation, and it is also stuck down with some adhesive, and it is not critical if you were to damage one of those cables trying to lift them up or remove them, but it's nice if you can keep them intact. in case you want to ever use, if the display is still functional, maybe you want to try using it as a test display or something like that. So no need to damage it if you don't have to. So again, make sure that you've lifted your FFC connectors clamps on those two cables. As you can see, there's a little bit of copper showing through there. Each one of those is a separate cable with a separate connector. So when we go to remove or lift up that daughter board, we're going to want those to slide out of their connectors and avoid tearing them or damaging them. Now, mine on the left side got kind of bent there a little bit, so that's just going to make it a little harder for us when we try to put them back in. But it will still be fine. Now there's a little bit of black tape covering over the solder joints. We'll have to remove that. We're going to smooth out this adhesive because we're going to reuse that. Now I really shouldn't have pulled up on this bottom left corner. I should have pulled from the top left corner, but I forgot. So be careful that you don't pull that and actually grab a hold of that cable, because you could pull some pads loose if you yank on that. Luckily I wasn't pulling too hard and I only got just the corner, so nothing was damaged. We're going to put some kapton tape over this adhesive just to help shield it from some of the heat. That will help deflect some of the heat from the hot air station when we go to remove this cable. I just don't want it to get all melted, and I want to be able to reuse it. Then at the top, where those cables are sticking out, we're also going to put another piece of kapton tape over those as well, just to kind of give us a little bit of protection from any heat, deflect any heat that might go that direction. Really shouldn't be too much of a problem, but better safe than sorry. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a little flux on the solder joints here, and we're going to take some leaded solder and we're going to flood those solder pads with the leaded solder, and that's going to help make it easier to remove this cable. So the difference between this cable and the first generation is pretty obvious. There's one continuous set of rows that can be soldered. On the first gen, there's actually two separate sides that have to be soldered, and it makes it a little difficult to line up. So I kind of like this better. It makes it easier to line up and solder the new one back on. I'll put a link in the description to my first gen repair video. If you want to, you can reference that. There were a lot of problems in that video as well. We're going to add a little bit more flux to this. We just preheated it with our hot air station. Now we're going to come back and we're just going to gently lift up on the cable. We're not forcing it, and we're just going to allow the weight of that board to sort of pull it loose. The first generation video, I struggled a lot in that video to try and make it work, and hopefully in this particular video I kind of solved some of those camera angle problems that I was experiencing with the first one. So no pulled pads there, and that's good. So now we'll actually stick it down. Just use that tape to kind of tape it down and hold it into place. But first we're just going to take another quick look, just showing that all of the pads are nice and shiny silver. Haven't pulled any pads or anything. Now that we've got the board nice and cleaned back up again, and we're going to take the new display and line this cable up using two little windows on either side to line up the little copper squares on each end. So as you can just see those copper squares shining through the little windows, that's what we want. We want those to be lined up perfectly. So now we're just going to put a little bit of solder in underneath. I'm sorry, flux is what I mean, a little bit of flux. We've already tinned the pads, so there's a little bit of solder on each one of those pads. And we're just adding a little bit of flux in between the cable and those pads. We're going to line those squares back up again on either side. Pay close attention. You'll be able to see the little copper squares showing through the windows. Once we have those perfectly lined up, we're happy. We're going to tack them down on either side with just a little bit of solder. A little bit here, a little bit there, and that way it won't move around on us. It'll be perfectly aligned. We're going to add just a little bit more flux on the top here, and that's going to help the solder to flow up through the holes on each one of these pads. So it's very nice just having the one continuous set of rows there of pads to solder instead of two. I think that makes this much easier and quicker. So we just want to make sure that every one of these little pads has got solder flowed up through the holes and is making good connection. We'll clean off the flux residue with some 100% alcohol. Then we're going to want to put some kapton tape over those solder pads there. Each joint is exposed. We don't want that to touch the back of the display. That would cause the screen to malfunction. So the black tape that we took off essentially is what protects it from touching. We're just going to use some fresh new kapton tape, which will serve the same purpose. It's just a microscope view of showing each side lined up perfectly and all the joints are flowed nicely with solder. Now I'm using my scissors there dangerously close to my cable, so we don't want to cut all the way through that. Now that we've got that safely covered, we can flip this back around and insert the two cables into their respective connectors. And it's a a little bit tricky. There's adhesive on the back side of the board and also on the little cable sticking out in between the two other cables that we're trying to insert into their connectors. And it kind of sticks and stuff, so you have to kind of fuss with it just a little bit. And after a little bit of fussing and persuasion, we finally get them lined up nicely, and we can push them in as far as they will go, and we'll be able to push their little clamps back down to hold them in place. Now we'll go ahead and put the home button back on as well, and once we're done with that, we'll be able to test this, make sure everything is working properly. So the bracket's not sitting flat. There's something preventing it from sitting flat, and it looks like more of this hot snot glue is in the way, so we're going to get that out of there. And we will be able to put this button back in now and set that bracket in there nice and firm and flat against the screen. I'll insert the cable into its connector and push the clamp down. Just make sure that the bracket's nice and firmly seated. And now we can test the screen and make sure that everything is working as it's supposed to. So again, I'm going to fuss around with the camera angle a little bit, try to make sure you can actually see what's going on. We do not want to disconnect or reconnect anything with the battery connected, so be sure that that battery has something preventing it from making contact whenever you disconnect or reconnect the display. Now that we're fully connected, we'll go ahead and put the screw back down on that battery connector, and we'll be able to power it on and test it. So we'll take one of these icons and we will slide it around all around the screen and check for any sort of dead spots. If this thing lets go and drops the icon, there might be a dead spot. Or if it's jumping around, or if it's choppy, if it's not smooth, anything like that. So we're looking for that sort of thing. And we're happy with that. It's nice and smooth. Everything is very responsive. So we're going to disconnect the battery again, and we're going to get this thing ready to put back together. So before we move on to the frame, we're just going to go ahead and remove the masking off the back of these other, the cable that we soldered, and stick those guys down. Once that masking is removed, we can stick these cables down and just go ahead and fold. You don't need to over crease them, but just fold them down a little bit into the edges of the display. And we'll go ahead and put our tape back over these connectors that we removed earlier. Now here, we went around the edges and we cleaned everything up nicely. We're getting ready to put the new adhesive back on. I got the camera bezel in place, and then suddenly at some point the camera froze. So didn't get any of that. I thought it was recording, but apparently not. So we had to pick up wherever it left off, which is basically I've already reconnected the screen and the battery connector, and we're just putting the metal brackets back in place. So you'll see the short screw goes in the two holes closest to the battery connector, and the longer ones go in the two holes in the back. So I was interrupted during the process of doing this video, so I had to set some of this aside, and that may have contributed. So we have that little square and that square, they all go together. That goes with the battery, so you can kind of see there, and of course the screw holes will line up properly. Otherwise, if you flipped it around the other way, the holes will not line up. The two longer screws are going to go in closer to the display connector, metal bracket for the display connector, and then the other four are shorter. So I'm sure I was interrupted several times during this video, and that may have contributed to losing out on some of the footage. But we did get some of the critical points across. Hopefully this video will be useful for someone out there. We're going to do a quick final test before we close it up permanently. Make sure it's still doing everything we expect it to do, that nothing has sort of magically changed. If you get a message saying that the home button security feature cannot be initialized or something of that nature, then you may have damaged the cable, or it may not be plugged in all the way. So make sure you don't have any of those kind of messages popping up. If you don't get that message, then the home button security feature should be fine. We did get a little message there, but that wasn't the same one. That was something about signing into someone's account. So we're satisfied with all of that. We're just going to go ahead and close it up now. We'll remove the masking off of the new adhesive, and we'll be able to stick the new screen down. Get this masking off of the screen here. And anyway, if this video was useful or helpful, if you liked it, like and subscribe. It really does help me out when you do that, and I appreciate you watching. You can see it is charging, and we are all set and good to go. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time. Bye bye now.